Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last, but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. It's inevitable. You're listening to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, a family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. The trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, turn off the podcast now. And I will put a plug in as well if you're listening on Spotify. Please give us a rating and turn on that notification. Follow us. If you're listening on YouTube, please give us a like, subscribe, turn on that bell notification as well so you can get a notification when we post an episode every Wednesday. And that being said, Trace told me he was unprepared for his fish facts, so I'm going to steal his fish facts.
No, I'm prepared. I just didn't think of one. I can always think of one on the fly, though.
So did you know that they use clams to determine the water toxicity in Warsaw, Poland?
They do that everywhere. Clams are
they do that everywhere?
Yeah, clams are used to test water quality.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So they actually have a little like spring that they glue on top of them. And so whenever they open up, I think it's when they open up, it touches a little sensor right above them, so it like lets them know that the water quality is good or bad or something like that. But they use a cool little system. Yeah.
Well, I tried to steal Trace's fish fact, but he already knew it, so he stole it back from me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I told you.
Do you want to do another fish fact then, or do you want to? Okay, go ahead.
So the one that I came up of, even though I was technically unprepared, there's a type of cat shark called a swell shark, and these sharks whenever they get threatened or something, they swell up, giving their name, so they can like wedge themselves in between rocks. And they're also biofluorescent, which isn't bioluminescent. They're basically glow in the dark is what they do.
So it's a glow in the dark Mrs. Puff, but a shark.
Sure.
Cool. I'll take that. So sitting with us quietly and patiently, we have our beloved guest, Reverend Harrison Smith. He has come back to haunt us once again. He has decided that we are not off-putting company, and he's decided to rejoin us for part 2 of Is the Bible Viable? How are you doing, Harrison?
I'm doing splendid. I don't know if I've decided whether or not you're off-putting enough to keep coming back. We'll make up my mind later.
Now that I'm back in Pennsylvania, I am officially off-putting. I can say that. I'm not eating as much junk food anymore, so. I mean, if I had a cricket effect, I'd have played it right there. All right, well, I guess we'll roll on here then. So, Harrison, what do you got for us today? Let's pick up. I know it's been a while, so I'm a little rusty on how exactly we left everything off, but
that's why I got my trusty notes.
Heck yeah, there we go. All right, well, over to you, good sir. What do you have for us?
All right, so just a brief review. Last time we talked about several methods of what we call inspiration for how the Bible may have been written. And then we jumped into this wonderful thing that, the Bible exists is probably one of the greatest proofs that it has a divine origin, right? And we had that little confusing bit about how can the Bible prove itself? And that's not inherently what we had meant. We came to the conclusion that the fact that over 1,500 odd years, 66 books written by over 40 different authors not only agree, but are in fact complementary to each other. And for such a collection to actually take place and to be compiled is proof that it has been guided and protected by a divine nature.
That is a great summary. Thank you for that. Trace, do you have anything to interject there? Because I know you and Harrison were going at it a lot more than I was on the last episode.
I vaguely remember all of my conversations.
He doesn't remember all of his smart aleck comments.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
He'll just have to come up with new ones.
All right. Well, that'll move me into the next point of discussion. We're going to start shifting a little bit from the logical arguments and into more of the historical arguments, but we're still going to be using that logic at the beginning part here, and then depending on how far we get, we'll get a little more historical in nature.
Sweet. I love history.
I know you do.
Yeah.
I know you do. You probably should write a book or something.
It's almost like I already... Oh, wait. For those
Yeah.
listening who don't know, I did indeed write a novel. It's not a history book. It's Home of the Shadicans. It's available on Amazon and several other locations, I think. So, but anyway, over to you, Harrison. Thanks for that interjection.
You're welcome. All right. So this one, we're going to look at the effect that the Bible has on nations that it has been introduced to. So we're going to start naturally with its own home nation, right? The nation of Israel, where the Bible fully came into context because the Bible didn't exist until the New Testament was written, right? Um, we had the Old Testament writings, which were divided in between the Torah, the Law, and the Prophets, and the historical writings, which we'll get into later on this episode. But the Bible, as we know it today, all 66 books, didn't happen until after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the writings of his apostles.
Right.
When you see the Bible being introduced into a nation, you see this dramatic change in that nation. There's a new spurring of morality and a new change in how worship is done, even by pagans and other beliefs in that nation. For example, the most notable contribution in the Roman Empire, almost all sacrifice practices ceased within 50 years of the introduction of Christianity and the Bible. And it's not just Rome that this happened to. This would spread around the world with each nation. It's just Rome happens to have the best picture because that is where it is most historically noted.
So let me kind of summarize there and make sure I'm understanding it. You're proposing the Bible's viability based off of the effect that it's had on other nations such as Israel and Rome. That's kind of the premise you're outlining here in a nutshell.
Yes, I'm establishing the fact that the Bible has a divine origin based upon its impact that it's had globally.
Okay. So I can get behind that idea, and I can actually argue with this one a little bit. So this will be a little bit of fun. So Trace, feel free to jump in as you see fit here. But couldn't you also make an argument that the ideas behind the Bible were maybe just more convenient? Because a lot of times, the way that the ancient religions function, it often involved traveling to a specific location, such as the temple in Jerusalem or I'm forgetting the name of the big temple thing in Greece. Help me out there.
The Athens?
No, not specifically Athens, but I'll have to look that up.
You talking about Oracle?
Not necessarily the Oracle, but that'd be another good example. But there's all these locations all throughout the ancient world where you had to travel to these locations to make sacrifices and present offerings. So is it possible that Christianity was just more popular because of the lack of having to travel and because the ideas were revolutionary in a sense in terms of not having to perform works to earn your way to heaven, so it felt more comfortable, therefore more people were ready to accept it. Hopefully that made sense. I was kind of a little bit disjointed there.
So just to restate your question to ensure I understand it, you're asking if people would have come into Christianity because it was more convenient. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, pretty much. That's ultimately the premise, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you what's very convenient about giving up everything in your life.
Touche. I guess I stand corrected there. I like it. That is true.
So this is just a recording of what one of the early churches and what they did. In Acts 2, this is talking about the church in Israel, right? It said, "And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and good, and parted them to all men." Right? That doesn't sound very convenient to me. Not only did they do that, but they also lived with each other daily and did everything as a body of believers together. That doesn't sound too convenient to me. I mean, it also goes into a whole bunch of other things about what we prefer in human comfort, but naturally, this was the implication in teaching that was followed.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I guess I could get behind that. My only vague counterpoint I would have is maybe the psychological comfort was a little bit more than the physical comfort, but I don't think there's much grounds for that there, so I can't really think of any good counter to that. So Trace, you got any counter? Any interjection? 'Cause you just shrugged at me a second ago when I tried to get you to talk, so I'm going to make you talk now.
I don't really know. I mean, I think there is an argument there that I don't think it would be every single case of Christianity spreading around that it would be people selling off their entire lives to devote themselves to this religion. I still think there could be an argument made for there's some convenience there.
All right, well, fair enough, I guess. I guess we really don't have much of a counterpoint on this one, Harrison, so if you want to take us on to your next point, or if you have any other interjections, Reverend, over to you.
So just to be clear, I'm not saying that it is completely inconvenient either. There are great things that come with the whole living together in unity, and there's also a great many taskings that come from doing this, right? You'll see it repeated many times by all the apostles and many of the teachings that you have to give up certain things. There's lots of things that challenge them to change from the idolatrous lives that they were living and outcasting themselves from the society they were a part of. So it's not inherently convenient or inconvenient. There's a lot of change that is required. And
Right.
most of the time, it does lean toward that inconvenient side because when you're first coming into faith and coming into this walk, it demands a lot out of you.
Yeah, no, that's true. I can agree with that from my studyings of the early church, for sure.
All right. So we're going to move on to the next point. This is, again, we're still moving on to some of the logical stuff, and now we're going to have some historical facts that kind of back this up. All right. Moving into just looking at who wrote the Bible. The vast majority of the Bible scholars and writers, Bible writers in this time were uneducated people. They weren't, grand scholars. They weren't people that were out there holding countless talks at the Delphi, at the court, or anything like that. There's only one educated man that we know of in the New Testament, and that man is Luke, and he was a doctor, not a writer. And so that being said, we can see from how the other church fathers talked about the early apostles, we know that they weren't educated men. You can look at the writings of the martyr, writings of Irenaeus, the Muratorian canon, Eusebius, Athanasius, and all these other things that talk about the early church authors and how they were lowly until they eventually came to the canonization of the Bible.
Yeah, and I mean, you got to look at doctors too. Just kind of thinking, expounding upon your point a little bit. Doctors back then were not nearly as educated as doctors today in any way, shape, or form. The understanding of medicine was very rudimentary in comparison. So Luke's education would definitely have not been like publishing 50 peer-reviewed articles or anything like that either. So I could definitely get behind that. Trace, you're awfully quiet. You were participating so much the last episode. Come on, let's get some snarky comments in here.
I just feel like I don't really have much to say right now.
Well, fair enough, I guess. So I don't think you're getting any disagreement from us yet, Harrison.
Oh, come on. I'm trying to start a fight.
I'm trying too. Trace is out of it. He woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, I think.
I guess so.
Is there a right side of the bed to wake up on?
There is indeed a right side of the bed as opposed to the left side of the bed.
It depends on your point of view.
Yeah, it's all relative. It's all subjective. There's no absolute truth.
It's all a simulation.
Okay. Oh, Lord, have mercy. All right. Okay, I gotta stop laughing so I can actually talk. Let's try this.
I'll give you a pause for a second. I looked it up. What I was referring to was the Pantheon from earlier.
Oh yeah, the Pantheon.
That's what I forgot
Yeah.
about the name of.
Okay. So the last sort of logical point before we start moving into all the historical stuff, which is going to be so much fun, is going to be the impact of the Bible is beneficent. The word was slipping my mind is beneficent. Right? There was evil that people have done in the name of the Bible, but that is not because of what the Bible says itself. Inherently, any society that rejects the principles of the Bible truly suffers, right? You can see this come about in the Roman Empire when they started to fall and started to move away from what the Bible had written and what had been said. You can see this in the Italian Renaissance, the French Renaissance, the Spanish Inquisition, right? These are all things that show you when nations move away from biblical faith and beliefs that they start to suffer. Even the painted history of Israel, the nation that we're going to be talking about extensively the rest of this time that we're here, shows you every time they begin to move away, they begin to suffer. But when they rely on it, you see the nation thrive.
So your argument here, just to summarize it, is that when you truly follow the Bible, there is good that comes from it for yourself and for the people around you. And so that is an argument in of itself for divine inspiration to a degree.
Correct. Now, I understand this is a weaker point because you're like, oh well, I mean, could just be wise writings. Well, yeah, but where's the wisdom coming from?
Right. So, no, yeah, I can see this going multiple ways for sure, because you can argue that there are certain things that are just objectively good that can be inferred by a collective consciousness or common sense of a number of people, such as mass murder or adultery or, being a false witness, especially in a court of law. Trace, what do you got? You leaned forward. Finally getting a smart comment from Trace. Here we go.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're both saying is that if you follow everything in the Bible, nothing bad can come out of it? Or if you're following it word by word, because obviously there are actions taken that are like, oh well, I'm doing this because the Bible told me to do so, but they just misinterpret it or something like that.
Yeah, because you have things like the Crusades that were actually political, and it was disguised as being biblical, and it really wasn't. And we could talk about that in another episode. But so looking at true teachings of the Bible.
So I can't tell you where. I don't know the specifics of this, but I see all the time the videos of people saying okay, well, basically it just says somewhere in the Bible that slavery is okay. So what do you say to that? Because I feel like that's a pretty bad thing for the Bible to teach, is it not?
Oh boy. Okay.
You're in for a treat, Trace. I know it's coming, but I'm going to let Harrison take it off here.
Okay. So let's take things back into context, right? Where does it say in the Bible that slavery is okay?
I don't know the specifics. I've just I see all of the videos all the time.
I can answer that. There's discussions. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Harrison, but there's discussions of it in the Old Testament law that's given. There's certain regulations for how it's supposed to be handled, and I'll let you explain the context there. I'm not going to address that. And then also in the New Testament, it talks about for those that are already slaves, it gives guidance to them for how they're to behave and how they're to treat their masters and how masters are to treat their slaves. And the New Testament does not say that the masters are to set their slaves free, unless I'm egregiously remembering something wrong.
Okay. So let's start taking this back into context. The first things we have to remember, slavery existed outside of the Bible before the Bible even wrote about it. Okay. So one of the earliest examples we can see of Hebrew slaves in Exodus and Leviticus, it talks about, who slaves are and what they ought to do and how they ought to be treated. And that's the biggest part of the slave law in the Torah, is talking about how they ought to be treated, right? It never really says anything besides one that gets sold or one that gets, chooses to willingly serve their master. Nowhere in there does it say, you know what, this is a good thing. Instead, it puts restrictions on how people can be maltreated when they willingly subject themselves to a term of servitude. And furthermore, it doesn't take time to sit there and go, yeah, you ought to do this, you should do this. And no, hold on, I'm trying to pull up my scripture so I can walk you through one of these passages.
My
Just
recollect my recollection as well on the context was it wasn't actually so much just like, oh, you're a slave for life in the way that we kind of understand slavery today. It was more of like you would trade a certain amount of time to indenture yourself as a servant or a slave to someone to pay off something like a debt. And then there was guidance as to if you wanted to continue being a slave or a servant for that person, then how that would be executed, at least in the Old Testament.
right. All
We
right,
can
so
go ahead.
I was going to go ahead and start bringing up some of the actual scripture on slavery if y'all wanted to discuss that, or do y'all want to take a brief break here before we dive in?
You read my mind. Thank you so much, Harrison. I didn't want to interrupt you and be rude, but yeah, we do need to take a short break, so we will be right back after this brief message. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, Musers. Harrison Smith is going to deliver the promised scripture verses before the ad break. Over to you, Harrison.
All right, so for those of us listening along, if you want to grab a Bible and read it for yourself, turn to Exodus chapter 21, and we're going to start in verse 2. All right, so this comes after a lot of commandments that have been given and instructions about how the Hebrews ought to live. And this is talking about how you deal with a servant, right? So 21 verse 2. If you buy a servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the seventh he shall go free for nothing, right? So there's a confine there, right? No more than 6 years of service, and on the seventh they have to be set free. If he came in by himself, that means he was alone, wasn't married, he'll go out by himself. If he was married, then his wife goes with him. If his master has given him a wife and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself, right? Because the master gave it to him, and so he can't have something that wasn't given to him. It sounds kind of messed up, but that's better than what was. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, right? So this is where he says, I'm willingly. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges, and he shall also bring to him to the door, or unto the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. So the slave has a choice to willingly serve the master continuously because he loves his master and his wife and children. And so that's what the original earring was meant for in the Hebrew, right? And it goes on and on and on here. But I want you to come on down to verse 12, right? And this is talking all about these servants and what they can do and what, if you sell a daughter and they get married and all that sort of stuff. And then we come down to verse 12 here. And it says, he that smites a man so that he shall die, he shall surely be put to death, right? And if a man lies not in wait, but God delivers him into his hand, then I will appoint them a place where they can flee. So we hear in this continuation of how you treat a slave that if you strike them and you kill them, then your life is forfeit, right? That's just what it is. You are not going to treat them in such a way that you cannot, treat anyone else. This punishment was the same for, striking and hurting a free person. It goes on to talk about how you do this. But basically, it puts the restrictions on masters to not abuse their slaves. Is less about, what's the words? This is less about how people were, words are escaping me. This is more about God showing how we ought to treat one another and less about, it's okay to own slaves, because he's not saying that. He's saying you're not going to abuse people and hold them forever because they're not meant to be that way. He's saying you're going to free them. You're going to treat them with respect and dignity. You're not going to abuse them more than anything else.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Trace, that was your point. What do you have to say back to that?
Makes sense. I mean, I it was a more so acceptable thing there. So if anything, it definitely does counteract it with saying like, oh, hey, here's how you should be doing it instead of abusing them. So that makes sense.
Crickets. I think we're good, Harrison, unless you got anything else for us on this point.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to say that even in the New Testament passages where it's referred to again in Philemon, concerning the case of Onesimus, that it reflects the same thing. In Galatians and Ephesians, it talks about how a master ought to treat his, slaves and how slaves ought to treat their masters. It's talking about creating a right relationship. And the context of slaves in that time was very different. Most everyone was a slave in that society. They had to be a slave in order to work most of the time. And so it's not the same context of a slave that most people think about when they think about chattel slavery. And that's a completely another topic, and it was completely against what is taught here in the Bible.
So basically what I'm hearing you say is it's kind of like the King James and how the English for the King James, the language has changed very drastically from then to now, so that most people, when they read the King James, have no clue what it's talking about. It's kind of the same thing for the word slavery here, where the concept has changed so much just because of language and definition that it means a much more very drastic thing for us than it did back in ancient times. That's kind of the ultimate point you're getting at here?
Yes, context is important.
Context is always important. I agree with you there 100%.
All right. Can we take a brief break real quick?
Yeah, we'll take another quick ad break. Trace, over to you to bring us back.
Welcome back. I've been put on the spot once again.
Oh, I love doing that. You never know what you're going to get from Trace. All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, Musers. Harrison, go ahead and kick us off after that brief pause there.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap there, we were referring to following biblical principles typically leads to what is called a beneficiary effect on that nation, on that society as a whole. And when a nation abuses the word of God or they start walking away from it, they typically start seeing a decline or a fall in their principles, in their general upbeing, and how they begin to typically just fall apart and collapse. This is not to say that a nation that follows biblical principles cannot endure hardships. It's just to say that generally speaking, there is a benefit, a clear benefit to that nation when they do follow. And then we went into a discussion about slavery.
Yeah, that about sums it up perfectly. You have anything else for us on this subject, or are you going to start laying out the historical?
I'm good to move on to the historical stuff if y'all are.
Unless Trace has any objections.
Let's do it. Let's get into history.
Okay. So that being said, being that we're moving into this more historical sort of discussion, I do have to kind of lay out some cards. I am relying on the writings and teachings of other people because I am not a pure expert in all the historicity and the archaeological research that is required. So I'm going to reference the people I'm going to be referring to up front, so that way everyone can go do research on me, make sure I am doing them justice. The first person I need to give some credit to is going to be K.A. Kitchen and his book on the reliability of the Old Testament. I also need to give reference to Marc Brettler and How to Read the Jewish Bible. And then I also need to give reference to Dr. John Taylor and his lectures on the canonization of the Bible. That way,
if you could send me all of those after we're done here, so I can put them in the show notes for the listeners that they want to do research and check your work, so they don't have to go back through and listen; they can just read it.
I certainly can do.
Thank you. And I'll also be having someone that has a PhD in history on very soon to the show, and I'll probably ask him to listen back to this episode. So if you get anything wrong in the historical aspect, I'm sure he'll completely destroy you in future coming episodes.
Well, as I said, it's not exactly my work that he destroys.
Making sure you're getting it right. No, I'm kidding. It's my dad, and he's actually pretty chill. So I'm sure he won't destroy you. But anyway, what do you got for us?
All right, so we got to start talking about the rules of how we critique and understand text, especially ancient text is this, right? So we need to talk about where it came from, how do we know it's reliable, and certain things like that. So the first thing I want to start talking about is the canonization of the Bible. How did it come about? How did it happen? Why did it happen? Because we have to turn to that to go start following the traces back all the way back to ancient times. Because it doesn't make sense to start from, 2000 BC and we haven't a clue what society was like that. So we have to start from, around 300 AD and work our way back. So we actually have context and take our baby steps into it. So
Tracing back, that's the appropriate name for our co-host here.
Okay.
So the canonization of the Bible, contrary to popular belief, was not at the Council of Nicaea. The canonization of the Bible was typically referred to as complete after the writing of the Easter letter in the year 367 AD. What happened is typically one of the church elders would send out what is called the Easter letter, which would let everyone know when Easter was supposed to be according to the calendar, right? We see this still done today, that the church goes back and reviews the differences between the different calendars at the time and how it aligns with the solar dates, and we pick up Easter. But they also included with that a list of what are called the authoritative books of the Bible, right? So the books that they had found were still, accurate, and they were still faithful to what the entirety of the church believed. So in 367, it should have been Athanasius who wrote this letter. And when he wrote this letter, it was after a series of letters that had taken place from about 90 AD to 367 AD, where they would have councils from time to time, and they would start talking about, okay, so what makes a book a part of the Bible? Or what's going to be in our completed New Testament and Old Testament, right? They began to start reviewing, each of the writings of the apostles and all the many letters that they had received from the apostles at the time. They started looking at close followers of the apostles, such as Luke, right? They started looking at people such as Barnabas and started seeing their writings. And they looked at Paul and his writings and started comparing them to each other. And so the first thing they started looking for was what we call internal consistency. So this is going to be our first test, internal consistency. Basically, does what Matthew wrote agree with what Paul wrote, agree with what James wrote, and agree with what Barnabas wrote, right? And so what they did, they took the Gospel of Marc, read through it, compared it to the other four Gospels, and they were all like, hey, you know what? They agree here, here, here. They don't agree with what's written here in the Gospel of Thomas, right? And so what we're seeing here is the Gospel of Thomas doesn't fit. So we're going to set the Gospel of Thomas to the side and start moving to other things, right? And so they would compare each of these letters and each of these books, and they would also did it retrospectively, and they went and reviewed the Old Testament and did that as well. So we'll pause there and give you a brief time of reaction in response to that.
So their main criteria was whether or not it agreed?
That is one of the main criteria. That's kind of the main starting point.
Okay, yeah. Well, if that's the starting point, then I don't necessarily have any contentions with that. I think that's a logical flow, is to lay everything out and see what agrees. And then if you have like 10 things that agree and one thing that disagrees, and you know through other criteria that the source is reliable, and you want to set that one aside that disagrees, I don't necessarily see any problems with that.
Nothing from Trace?
Nope, he's spacing.
Josiah and you are hitting all the good points. I mean, if this, like you said, this is just the starting point, so there's not really much to comment on, I think.
So what Trace is saying is at the end here, he's going to have a lot of smart interjections when you lay out all of the evidence for us. That's what he's promising all of the listeners right now. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. All right, go ahead, Harrison.
And so the next sort of thing they would compare is their style, right? Was this meant to be, something that was written for other people's benefit, right? So you start looking at the different letters, how they are written, and you start looking at, say, letters like Philemon amongst all these other letters. You're like, this doesn't look like it belongs. But then you look at how it is almost completely referenced in Paul's other writing, the book of Galatians, right? Galatians and Philemon were written side by side, and they were both meant to be read before the church, right? They weren't just done out of happenstance. They were written to educate and help enlighten. Then you compare that to other books that were written around that time and other writings that Paul himself wrote that weren't intentional for everyone's benefit. Letters that he wrote between other authors and other believers that just didn't have as much benefit. And so they had to start whittling down what really was edifying of the church and what wasn't. So he comes back to that whole style and intention behind each author. Now, obviously, when they were closer to their origin, they had a better understanding, and then you would look at how that was passed down. How each letter was either copied or vocally sent down. Most of the actual authoritative books were written down over and over and over, hand copied. And when you look at the evidence of what we call the Textus Receptus, which is all the copies of all the books of the Bible and their original language, and how many times they were rewritten, transcribed, and we have more transcripts of that than any other book in the world. So we can tell that it was accurately copied and accurately relayed. All right, so that's going to be kind of numbers 2 and 3 go right hand in hand, which is the style and the accuracy of the copying.
So here's a question, then you might not have the answer to this right off the top of your head, and that's fine if you don't, because this is very specific. But what is the earliest manuscript that we have for things like the New Testament, and then for things like the Old Testament? Because, I mean, the ultimate, I know we have to look at Scripture as a whole to validate it here, but the ultimate intent for us is Genesis. So that's kind of where my main interest is, and Genesis goes pretty far back. But there's a wide net that we kind of have to cast out when we're looking at all of Scripture because of the argument you've laid out for us.
Absolutely. I cannot remember that one off the top of my head. Actually, let me look at my notes from Dr. John Taylor. The earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are portions of the book of John, and that was 125 AD.
Okay, so that's the oldest document that we have of anything from the New Testament.
Yeah, so I'm saying hesitantly looking at my notes, but that is what Dr. John Taylor is talking about here. I will have to go back and review other notes for y'all later, but
Okay.
that's the quickest answer I can give you.
I mean, that's not terrible because the common understanding is that the Gospel of John was written around 90 AD, 80 to 90 AD. So having a copy that's 35 to 45 years after the book was written, that's not atrocious.
Yes, especially when you consider that most books typically weren't copied until at least 100 years afterwards, especially that time frame.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest parts that most people don't have a context for. A lot of people are like, "Oh, well, if it's so important, why didn't they write it down immediately?" Well, because it is still mainly an oral society.
Not everyone could read or write. That's a relatively new thing, and the mainstream form of publication is also a very new thing, whereas you go back 300 years, the form of publication was drastically different.
Exactly. And so that's what we're talking about here. For there to be one copies of, the original within 30 to 40 years is dramatic. And then two, for have John to have written within 60 years. And then we have others like the book of James, which we believe is the earliest written one, around 15 to 20 years of the death of Christ. That is remarkable. That completely changes like how most people wrote back then. Most people didn't write about historical events until well after, right? 30 to 60 years is kind of like really fresh for them. Most of the time is written way retrospectively.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would. I don't think I have any contentions. I see Trace nodding his head, so I don't think he has any contentions or confessions.
I mean, yeah, I just kind of feel like I'm just learning today.
I thought this was going to be a break for me. I guess not.
I guess history's not repeating itself this time.
Look at that.
Okay. So now let's talk about criticism of, and I don't mean like, oh, I don't believe the Bible. I'm talking like, how do you critique that text that we've been talking about? So there's different types of critiques of text, and there's critical critique, there's literary critique, there's historical critique, and so what we're going to be focusing on is what we're going to call historical critical, right? It's a combination of critical style where you take the text and you take its original context and you just kind of mesh it up and you try and figure out what was meant, how was it said, how is it juxtaposed within itself, and sort of things like that. And then there's a historical critique where how does this fit within what we know about their society? How do we know? How does this fit within archaeological history? How does this fit within everything else that we see about this society through other historical terms? And so we're going to combine the two of those and to form a critical historical critique.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Sorry, I've got to flip pages in my notes.
I will have a couple things to talk about in this point, I think, from my knowledge of Bible history. So I'm eager to see what you have that you can lay out for us and then to go from there.
Okay. So the historical critical method is talking about taking the main context for interpretation and a time and place when it was composed, and taking the critical of simply means of reading the text independently of whatever religious norms or interpretive traditions, and combining the two to start forming an actual higher critical form, right? I think I kind of beat that to death, but I just want to kind of give the one word or one sentence definition that is provided by Marc Brettler as we move in here. So let's start diving in. When you start talking about historical context, we need to understand two things. And now I'm going to start focusing more on the Old Testament because that's where we are focused here. So we have two real questions we have to ask when we start talking about the Old Testament books. The first one, were the Old Testament books all composed within about 400 to 200 BC? All right, so that's the first question. And the second one is, are they pure fiction or are they real history from around that time, from around 2000 to 400 BC? All right, so those are the two questions we're going to start taking some time in to try and explore. And this may go real long or real short. It just depends on how many questions you're going to ask and whether or not my one example I want to give of each one and move forward is going to suffice y'all. So.
Fair enough. Trace, you are doing a very bad job this episode of being the resident skeptic. You need to step up your game.
I might have a couple contentions during this one.
Good. All right, let's hear it, Harrison.
Okay, so again, keeping this theme of moving from most recent to most ancient, we're going to start moving back in history because the kind of the best way to go about exploring this is by starting with what's most recent, so we can see something, the most common thing. So instead of starting with primordial history, which is what most of Genesis is, well, part of what Genesis is, and then we're actually going to start with the exile and the return of Israel, and then move back into the monarchies, the United Monarchy, settling in Canaan, the Exodus, back to the patriarchs, and finally back to creation.
So we're just going to go back in time, basically, and watch everything as it passes by us in our little time capsule.
Yep.
Sweet.
All right, so talking historical context first, moving into what we call in medias res, the in between, right? That exile and return period. We have to talk about. There's 4 steps we can use to analyze whether or not that book, the historical periods of that are referenced in Daniel, the Second Kings, Second Chronicles, and those books that are around this time, which of the exile and return, and whether or not they're accurate. So these are the 4 steps that we have. 1, we review foreign kings that are mentioned in Kings, Chronicles, Daniel, and so on and so forth, in the terms that they're mentioned and the external records, right? So we're not relying on just the Bible to prove itself, right? We have to look at those external records. Second, we're going to review, conversely, the mentions of Israelites and Judean kings in external and foreign sources. So what was said about the foreign kings, and then what did the foreign kings say about the Israelites and the Judeans? Third, we're going to move into local records from Hebrews, from Palestine, and all the other places that they were at, right? We're going to look at the other things that pointed to this is as a historical fact or this not. And then fourth, we're going to review the sequences of rulers as given in both external and biblical sources, as well as the complex issue of chronology being of all these different calendars that each one had. All right. So those are kind of our 4 main steps that we can use to validate the Old Testament.
I feel like you just described 4 cliffs, not 4 steps.
Yes.
Those are some big hurdles.
This is not a very light subject to get in, which is why I have books upon books on my desk and notes to kind of scroll through. It's this is stuff that people spend their entire life becoming experts in, and they typically only become an expert in one facet of it. So I am giving you a very light cropping of information from everything, just to kind of give you an idea that we have indeed verified the facts.
All right, sounds good. You want to take a quick ad break here, or do you want to get through analyzing your first point before we do?
We can take a quick ad break.
All right.
Drink water.
We will be right back.
Welcome back. I'm bringing us back in because I guess I'm not speaking enough, and Josiah likes to put me under pressure.
I do. You sometimes say funny things, and it works well for the podcast. So, Harrison, you got some scripture or something you were wanting to read for us, I think, to kick us off on analyzing our first point here.
Yep. So we are going to analyze the time period for the Kingdom of Israel, just to kind of highlight and run you through all these tests with just one king, one reign period. And so I'm going to turn to 1 Kings 11:40. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So here we hear of the Israelite king, we hear of the king of Egypt, and we have a time period reference, right, until the death of Solomon. So it gives us a lot to actually look at, a lot to see here. From the biblical account, we know that Jeroboam reigned for 22 years. Okay? So that gives us a 22-year time span to find evidence of his existence. Right? So Hebrew Kings and the contemporary sources shows us through there. That's when Jeroboam reigned. At the same point in time, it should have been Rehoboam in the kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom, that reigned also. And you can see that in 1 Kings chapter 14. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. Right? So we'll hear this reference. And it came to pass in the 5th year of the king of Rehoboam, right, 5th year of his reign, that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, right? So we hear that same king being referenced. So now we have 3 kings being referenced at one time period. Everyone following along?
Yeah, I'm tracking so far.
I think so.
I'm tracking. Okay. So we have this foreign king mentioned in biblical record, right? Not going to beat that up. It's pretty straightforward. It's referenced both times by both kingdoms. And so let's start looking into this, right? The word Shishkak or Shushkak depends on your spelling.
I think he died.
Right.
You there?
Yeah, sorry, my computer just like drops the internet. What was the last thing you heard?
You were just starting to talk about your point, and then you disconnected.
Okay. Are we still recording?
Yes, we're still recording. I
Awesome.
I don't do edits unless it's for like extreme pauses, but I'm gonna leave that in because that's great.
All right, so uh, in Hebrew, Shishkak or Shushkak, with the spelling difference based upon where you were, the king that harbored Jeroboam and who had rebelled against Solomon, invades Rehoboam's northern kingdom in the 5th year. This word corresponds very precisely with the name in the Egyptian inscriptions, Shushnik or Shushk, right? Uh, I don't want to try and like read off how this looks like it's spelled because it just is going to get more confusing to everyone. But you can go and look at the Egyptian inscriptions. This Libyan personal name is best rendered as Shoshanek, which is then how we get it in English, Shushkak. All that. Very fancy.
So
It
basically,
belonged to elite.
in Egyptian history, we have a reference to this king that's also referenced in the Bible, so that kind of gives validity that the Egyptians and the Israelites are talking about the same kings in the same time period, so therefore that provides a sense of proof to it, historically speaking.
Yes. Now for the fun part. There were at least 6 kings of Egypt with that name.
Oh boy.
Um, and then, yeah, so within the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, there were 6 different kings that had that name. This gives us from the time period of about 950 to 700 AD. Of all these kings, Shushnik the second through Shushnik the sixth have no link whatsoever with Palestine. So that gives us kind of Shushnik the first to be who is the founder of the 22nd dynasty, who has in his actual records of a campaign into Palestine and triumphant sequences where he reigns against Palestine. He names places such as Negev, the Galilee, um, at Stella, at Megiddo, right? So these give us an undeniable connection between Egypt, the accuracy of the name of the king given of Egypt, and the kingdoms being interacted with as Rehoboam says and as Jeroboam says.
Okay. I mean, I could get behind that. I don't see many issues other than to note that the Ashnakash name, it must have been the Henry or John of the ancient Egypt time. That's really my only observation here. Trace,
Yes.
smart comment. Go.
A lot of big names. I'm trying real hard to focus in on these names.
All right. And obviously I picked just one king, one time period. But it kind of to sit here and try and drag you all through, you know, what 600 several thousand years of history and cross compare all the evidence for each one would be not fun for anyone to listen to.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if listeners want to hear more, they should get the book that you're referencing, which is...
This book, specifically for the historical context, is On the Reliability of the New Testament by Kitchen.
There you go. So I think that that's a good argument. I don't have any contentions with that necessarily because I don't have any evidence, for or against that laying in front of me to contest his claim about the Egyptian king and the Egyptian pharaoh. But that makes sense to me. From Trace's
All
silence,
right.
I think we're good. Come on, Trace, step up your game.
I don't know what to say to this. It's just from what all I hear, it's just talking about kings.
Yes, we are using kings. This is just
I mean, so
the beginning.
the reason for using kings to help kind of contrast the time period is because kings were the most referenced in ancient times, and so that gives a little bit more of kind of an anchor in time because this king would be mentioned by name, and then you can identify the time period that king is correlated to.
I mean, sure, it might correlate to a time period of a king, but there's all kinds of legends and stuff that talk about actual people in the stories as well. So there's tons of myths and legends out there that would talk about. There's a lot of Norse saga stories referencing like kings of Norway or Denmark, stuff like that. So it might put it in a time place, but would that technically really make the story more accurate?
It gives us an anchor point to know that it's a true event that's going on if multiple different cultures are mentioning the same leader of the people independently from each other. At least
you might have multiple accounts of, oh, this guy was king at this time, but I feel like that doesn't completely validate the story right away, because I could say something about some English king and put some fake story behind it, but that doesn't mean it's going to be accurate just because, oh, well, it takes place during this king's reign and it mentions this king or this leader, so it makes it correct.
Harrison?
Yeah, so I'm not sitting here saying that, hey, it takes place during this person's time period as that's the only point of reference. That is a beginning point of reference to kind of highlight and show you that, one, these are societies that were at war with each other that also agreed in their historical record keeping, right? You don't see a fancy interpretation that was presented there, right? You see where Rehoboam's kingdom just simply writes, yeah, at this time, this guy from Egypt came up and attacked us. The Egyptian record, on the other hand, talks about their triumphs over, Rehoboam and his kingdom at that time. So it is their record keeping showing the validity and having both people, losers don't like to admit they lost. Winners will often exaggerate their wins, but you have the losers accurately attesting, yes, at this time we were attacked by these people. And we're using this to kind of start showing the historical authenticity of these, what's written down. When you have warring societies, one, agreeing on how a war turned out, and then two, you have each king's record keeping agreeing. And then you also have dozens of other local records, which we can get into if you're wanting to take some time to dive into that, which is actually what I turn to next, just in case.
I mean, it might make one point out of the entire Bible that says, okay, this story might have some validity to it because a lot of different accounts are saying this battle happened, but there's still so many other instances where I feel like that doesn't really apply, just to say that, okay, well, this one story, it pinpoints it accurately to a time period.
I see what you're saying. I picked one story simply because, it would be a lot to try and go through every single event recorded. However, the entirety of the Old Testament, I could go through most of this and reference it across multiple societies, multiple time periods where they actually attest to the accuracy of all this happening over and over and over and over and over again. I'm taking one case to make an example for the rest. I'm not simply saying that, yeah, all this just happened because one thing happened. No, I'm showing you kind of the evidence behind one, so you can see the examples of how evidenced the rest of the book is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see your point, but to me that just makes it seem like, okay, it's just another history book. It's not really anything to do. To me, it just doesn't feel religious. It just feels like, okay, well, this happened at some point in history.
I mean, to be fair, we were referencing history books.
Well, fair. I guess I'm just getting lost in everything.
Trace is confused, which is nothing new for him, I think. I would say here, I'll interject. Harrison is giving us one small little appetizer of a whole course of validity that exists sprinkled throughout Scripture. And you don't necessarily need to have every single story in Scripture validated by an external source, I would say. You just need to have, I'd say, probably like anywhere near 40 to 60%, where 40 to 60% of instances that are documented in Scripture consistently throughout a series of books, specifically referring to like the Old Testament, is referenced in other cultures such as Babylonian and Egyptian and Sumerian, and all of these other cultures are mentioning these things happening that the Bible's accounts are also affirming happen, then that lends credence. You don't need it to be for every single story. It's just if it's the majority, then the Bible is demonstrating its validity as a historical text and flow. Because, there's some very specific stories like Abraham taking Isaac up to a mountain and almost sacrificing him, where you're not going to necessarily get validity from that per se, unless you're looking at maybe like the Islamic accounts on that instance. So that would be my 2 cents on it. But Harrison, I'll kick it back over to you if you have... Well, actually, you know what? Tell you what, since I got the mic here, let's take a quick ad break, and we will be right back. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen. We kind of formulated a little bit of a plan here, and Trace is not fully satisfied with that answer, so we're going to push into that because we are seekers of truth here. So, Trace, over to you. What do you got for us?
It still just seems to me that, like, sure, it's valid as a history book, but I still don't really see how that would... Because, like I said, multiple stories and legends that are just that. They're just legends, exaggerated stories, whatever it is. They can still reference actual people and places, but just because it's historically accurate doesn't mean that the stories in itself are accurate.
Right. So what we are talking about here is not just being... not just having these stories in here as, whether or not they're historically accurate. Their historical accuracy attests to the actual validity of the teachings, right? So throughout this lineage, we talk about all these different kings and what they did and what they didn't do. And they referenced some of those principles that we were talking about earlier in our logical discourse. In logical discourse, you were accepting mostly of the beneficiary fact of someone following biblical principles. If you read through First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, there is no separating those when a king followed those principles and the rising of their kingdom and the falling of kingdoms when they walked away. And you can even see where God would give them chances through multiple kings before he would take away from them and have another nation rise up against them. So this is one of the interesting historical facts where you'll see a god, which was typically nationally aligned at that point in time, right? Taking another nation, rising them to strength to take over his own nation. This is extremely contrary to what most, what you call legends and myths will actually have happen, because a god was a god of their people, not of other people. But this goes to show, right, that we're combining the actual theology and historiology of what is seen here.
So basically, I'm trying to understand this. So basically, there's historical texts that say, like, just for example, these two kings battled each other. At a certain point, this king lost, and so the Bible is then adding a little bit of context to that, saying like, oh, well, they lost because of so-and-so, or like they lost because they stopped following whatever. Is that what you're kind of saying here?
That happens in part, yes. Right, so let's go back into it. It's 1 Kings 14. Oh, dum dum. 1 Kings 14 and 25, right? And that's where we see Rehoboam fighting against the king of Egypt. And so In 25, it says that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away their treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he took away all. He even took away all, and he took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made, right? And King Rehoboam made in the stead brazen shields and committed them unto the hands of the chief of the guard, which kept the door of the king's house. And so when it was so, when the king went into the house of the Lord, that the guard bare them and brought them back into the guard chamber, right? And it talks about everything that he did, and he's sitting there trying to defend, right? Because he didn't lose his nation completely because he did try to honor God, but he did suffer because of the many things that, if you look in nations before, he talks about the abominations that they did according to all the other nations around them. Right, so 24 says, and they were also sodomites in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations of the Lord, which he cast out before the children of Israel. And so, following that, after they commit all such of these abominations, Egypt was raised against them. Right, so you can see a little bit of that context in there. And after suffering consequence, he's like, "Oh man, we should really go back to protecting the house of the Lord and keep cherishing it." Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's just taking the historical account that's there and then adding context to it. So I can understand that.
And I think, too, another thing to keep in mind here, Trace, is Harrison isn't saying this is absolute proof that the whole Bible is true necessarily. This is just one step to say, hey, the Bible is probably telling us the truth here, and it is probably an actual real account.
Yeah,
Right.
I can get that.
So this is the first step, first cliff that we've almost climbed over. Not quite, though.
Right. So we have taken one incident and talked about the internal record within the Bible, which is those passages of First Kings. Then we talked about the external records, where we actually looked at Egyptian records recording this event happen. Then I can look at local records and talk about, hey, in the areas of Galilee and such where these battles are happening, the area of Jerusalem, did other people record this battle happening, right? What did the local populace say? Which is, we have we have records of that. We can show it, but it's just difficult to show something on a podcast because there's nothing to look at.
If they're listening on YouTube, I put a video into the episode that was released a couple weeks ago. So if they're listening on Spotify or anything like that, yeah, they're out of luck. Well, any final thoughts, gentlemen? I'll kick it over to you, Trace, for final interjections or contentions, and then I'll kick it over to our guest for the final word, and then we will wrap up this episode and continue next time.
I don't really have any thoughts. I think I'm more or less satisfied with my question now.
Harrison, Reverend, Father.
I'm not a father. I mean, I am a father, but not that kind of father.
Don't tell your wife that you said that you're not a father, otherwise you'll get in big trouble.
Anywho, so what I wanted to highlight, there are steps that we do to check the validity of the Bible, right? We talked about those kind of logical ones, the internal consistency amongst each of the books. We talk about the literary style. History presented as history must be accurate, right? Teaching presented as teachings must be accurate. Something that's meant for the benefit must be beneficial, right? And so then we also talked about our historical test that we have, right? To review records of the kings and chronicles and such that are mentioned inside the Bible. You have to check them against external records, right? Those are from foreign nations, the local records of the local populace. And then we have to look at all the complex chronology that happens around there and make sure that each kingdom's calendars line up and accurately attest to this. You can also look at some of the historical events that are aligned around the context, right? So what's happening in foreign kingdoms at this time that can actually attest to what's happening inside of it. And then we can also look at all sorts of extra things in the archaeology records and those things. So it's not just one simple story that I was telling, but one example that I've drawn out of many to attest to the accuracy of God's word.
I like it. Well, thank you for your time, Harrison. We're going to do one brief ad break here so we can sign off with our guests, and we'll be back in just a moment for our creature fact and closeout. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, we are back. Our guests signed off for the evening. Trace, you got your creature facts ready, or should I buy some time for a second so you can sort yourself out there?
You know, I'm half tempted to tell you, like, oh, say something smart. But I have it ready.
I honestly would deserve that. So, it would be fair.
Okay. No, my creature, I'm going to try and focus a lot more on like little cryptid stories for this, because I feel like they're a lot easier to tackle than large mythical beasts and other bigger stories.
And it's almost like we're building up to something like UFOs. Maybe. Who knows?
No, I'll never tell. But so this week we're gonna do drop bears out of Australia. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
They're basically just very vicious koalas.
Okay, wait a second. Australia already has wild enough creatures, and you're telling me they have cryptids too?
Yeah.
Australian cryptids have to be things like straight out of hell. I did not know that actually existed. Okay.
I mean, it pretty much is.
Okay, cool. So do tell.
So they're basically, drop bear is a very vicious koala bear kind of creature. It just lives in the treetops, and it attacks people that walk underneath the trees. So it'll just like jump down on their heads. They are said to have coarse orange fur with darker mottled patterns. And they are quite large, the size of a large dog, really. I believe this was proven to be a hoax.
I believe it for Australia, though.
Yeah. They actually did give it a scientific name, funnily enough. It is called...
Are you serious?
I don't know what this first part is. But Thylarctos plummetus.
Anything's possible down under, mate.
Yeah, but it is a hoax. That's just it's just stories told to tourists and children. So
well, it's nice to know they treat tourists as children. I'll bear that in mind if I ever go visit down there. So
yeah.
Well, you ready to close out?
Am I closing out?
No, I got you. I'm just
okay.
making sure you're good. You don't have anything else.
Yeah, I thought you were just gonna put me on the spot.
No, I've done that enough. I need to stop bullying you so much. Well, no other confessions, concessions, contentions, anything in that category. We're gonna wrap up here. You can get a hold of us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. You can find us on Facebook by looking up Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. And I think that's about it. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, those of you from listening on the earth, above the earth, and below the earth. We invite you to join this conversation. Send us an email. Communicate with us so you can participate in this conversation and transcend the limits of time.
If you're listening to this in a cave, please send us a picture of it, because that'd be great to know that people are actually listening under the earth.
It's fair. Please transcend time with us.
Toodles.